Welcome to AAUW's webinar today on unconscious bias. My name is Shannon Wolf. I am the Managing Director and Chief of Staff of the AAUW National Office, and I'm just delighted to be here today to moderate today's session on unconscious bias. With me today are three wonderful panelists, and I'd like to introduce them now. First up, we have Dr. Melissa Ingram. Melissa is chair of our National Inclusion and Equity Committee. She's a national AAUW member, and she is also Department Director of Theories and Principles for Adult Learning within Air University. Next up is Constance Morris Hope. Constance is the Diversity Chair and member of the Eastern Maryland AAUW branch. Constance is a certified executive coach, facilitator, and trainer, specializing in leader and organizational development in multicultural workplaces. And last but certainly not least, we have Shyla Rao Mistry. Shyla is a national AAUW board member and a member of the California Online branch. Shyla is a CEO and founder of JCO MMI and CEO and founder of STEM Institute. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for being here today for this really important and I know really educational webinar. The work that the Inclusion and Equity Committee has done on the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Toolkit is really quite impressive, and I'll put that link to the toolkit in the chat in a few minutes, but if you hadn't had a chance to look at that, I would really encourage you to do so. The Inclusion and Equity Committee is also updating content in that toolkit routinely, and one of the things that is being updated are our plug-and-play programs, and that's going to be the focus of our conversation today, or part of the focus today. Plug-and-play programs really provide support to branches to have their own diversity, equity, and inclusion programming locally, and those plug-and-play programs are being developed and will be added to the website, into that toolkit space as they are developed, and we'll get into that a little bit more today as well. Today's format's going to be pretty simple. We're going to have a presentation by Melissa, Constance, and Shyla, and then we will go into a Q&A session. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Melissa to start our session today. Melissa?
There we go. Okay. So more on our distinguished guests, Constance and Shyla, will be available in this slideshow. But they're quite impressive, and I'm very lucky that they both agreed to speak to all of us today on this really important topic. So just as a reminder, so the link to the toolkit will be in the chat. However, there are two different ways that you can get to the toolkit, and we'll go over them briefly right now. So one of them is going on the AAUW website and clicking on membership. From there, click on governance and tools. The other way to do it would be to look at the search function. And if you click on the search function, type in DEI toolkit. Either option will take you to the governance and tools page. And the second link will be the diversity, equity, and inclusion toolkit. From there, you'll see a variety of topics, and we try to step this for you. So if you have no idea what to do in terms of how to start a conversation for diversity, equity, and inclusion, start at the very top, and then we'll go over all the basics. So today's presentation will be under the key terms link, and under key terms and concepts, you can go down further in the page, and you'll find, again, we stair-step this with the definition of diversity. We go into what inclusion means and what equity means. So today we're going to talk about unconscious bias. And with that, I will turn this over to Constance.
Thank you, Melissa, and good afternoon to everyone. I'd like to get us started on this conversation by talking a bit about what unconscious bias is, why it is, and where it comes from. So I have a question for you. How many times in your personal or work life have you made a decision based on a preconceived opinion of someone or a group of people? So think back. Can you think of a time when you've made a quick decision, either personally or as part of a group, that you later regretted? For instance, when you meet or have met someone for the first time, you may have made an assumption or several assumptions about them, their career, their educational level, relationship status, and all of this is based on your first impression. It's very likely that you made that decision based on some type of unconscious bias, and you didn't even realize it. So what is this thing called unconscious bias, also known as implicit or hidden bias? This first slide shows the definition of unconscious and of bias from the Merriam-Webster dictionary. So the bias the definition of unconscious on the slide is not marked by conscious thought, sensation, or feeling, not knowing or perceiving, not aware, not consciously held or deliberately planned or carried out. That's the definition of unconscious, according to Merriam-Webster. The definition of bias is an inclination of temperament or outlook, especially a personal and sometimes unreasoned judgment, prejudice. So another way of looking at unconscious or implicit bias, hidden bias, is that it is a preference for or against a person, thing, or group held at an unconscious level. And we just defined unconscious. We don't know that our minds are holding on to this bias, whereas an overt or explicit bias is an attitude of prejudice that we endorse at a conscious level. And so this slide makes the distinction between conscious and unconscious bias. So unconscious or implicit biases are social stereotypes about people that we form without our conscious awareness. And they are essentially mental shortcuts that allow us to make fast decisions under pressure. And we're going to see how that happens in our brains, because that's the key to this whole thing, that we use these mental shortcuts to make fast decisions under pressure. So the title of this slide is The Necessary Purpose of Bias, and it reads that automatic, and in quotation marks, danger detector that determines whether or not something or someone is safe. So biases do serve a purpose. Having biases have likely been around for nearly as long as we've been human. And in the relative scheme of things, we have been, quote, civilized for only about 6,000 of the 2,500 or 400,000 years that we as Homo sapiens have existed. That means that we have spent hundreds of thousands of years depending on the ability to make quick judgments to stay safe from harm. As a result, our brains have evolved to react. And just think about it. We go out into the world every day and we make decisions about what is safe and what is not, what is appropriate or not, and so on. And this automatic decision-making is what psychologist Joseph Ledoux has suggested is an unconscious, quote, danger detective, as shown on this slide. This danger detector determines whether or not something or someone is safe before we can even begin to consciously make a determination. So when the object, animal, or person is assessed to be dangerous, a fight or flight fear response occurs. For example, this built-in danger detector, designed to enable our survival, makes us particularly responsive and watchful for threatening situations in our social environment. So when we meet people, our brains are ready to make a snap decision as to whether they are friend or foe. Are they part of our normal social group? Can we trust them? So these biases serve that purpose of an automatic danger detective. So this slide shows the part of the human brain called the limbic system. It is where our emotions live. And the amygdala, which you can see, I don't know if I can point that you can see, the amygdala is the oldest part of our brain, the most ancient part of our brain, and it is our alarm system, our danger detector. Our ancestors millennia ago relied on it to alert them to dangers like saber-toothed tigers and other predators. The hippocampus, which is also in the limbic system, plays a major role in learning and memory. This image also shows the part of the brain known as the prefrontal cortex or executive brain. And this is where logical decisions are made. So if you can imagine, scientists estimate that we are exposed to as many as 11 million pieces of information at one time. That's how much stimuli are coming into our brains at one time. But our brains are structured so that they can only really deal with 40 of them at a time. So we need a way to decide what are we going to pay attention to. How do we filter out the rest, those things that we don't pay attention to? How do we choose what to focus on? We do it by developing a perceptual lens that filters out certain things and lets others in, depending upon certain perceptions that we have, ways we interpret things, preferences, and yes, the biases that we have adapted throughout our lives. So humans are naturally hardwired to make assumptions about a person, a thing, or a situation without knowing their full story. This hardwiring can be found in the amygdala, which I just mentioned. It is when all of these stimuli are coming into our brains, the amygdala is the first stop. That's where these stimuli make their first stop in our brains. So your amygdala protects you from harm by interpreting subconscious hints of danger to trigger lightning fast responses. So while it takes around 300 milliseconds for you to become aware of a disturbing event, your amygdala reacts to it within 20 milliseconds. So it's really very, very quick. And so when this stimuli is coming into your brains and your amygdala gets a hold of it, it makes an assessment of that stimuli. Is this something to be afraid of, or is this something that's okay? And if the amygdala stimulates a threat response, the function of the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex shut down, and the fight, flight, or freeze mode takes over. Memory storage and retrieval, emotional processing, and executive function are disrupted. So we have a reaction to this threat. The amygdala hijacks our brain function and our higher brain function. And so we have this unconscious reaction to something that has been interpreted as being a threat. So how does unconscious bias work? This slide reads, this form of bias compels each of us to divide humans into stark categories, typically like me and probably harmless, and not like me, a potential threat. As a species, Homo sapiens have outgrown the prehistoric survival value of this mental reflex, but our brains are still wired this way. And so when we encounter something that's different, our amygdala may have a threat response or not. So what could signal a threat, perceived threat for the amygdala? Research on hidden bias reveals that in spite of the best intentions, most people harbor deep-seated resistance to the different, whether that difference is defined by such evident factors as race, gender, ethnicity, age, or physical characteristics, or more subtle ones such as background, personality type, or experiences. So an individual's first impression of people are based on all the perceptions they have accumulated since birth, plus environment and social upbringing. The ability to distinguish friend from foe helped early humans survive, and the ability to quickly and automatically categorize people is a fundamental quality of the human mind. Categories give order to life, and every day we group other people into categories based on social and other characteristics. This is the foundation of stereotypes, prejudice, and ultimately discrimination. The underlying problem is that our brains have evolved to see patterns in things that are complex and to categorize the world in order to simplify it. Remember all those millions and millions and millions of stimuli that come into our brains, and we have to have a way to deal with them. What do we pay attention to? What do we not pay attention to? What's a threat? What's not a threat? Thus, when we encounter another person, our brains rapidly and subconsciously try to figure out if he or she is friend or foe, in group or out group. Are they like us or are they not like us? This slide reads, these implicit biases are not deliberately or consciously created. They are products of our brain's self-generated definition of normal, acceptable, or positive. And they are shaped by many factors, from past experiences to our local or cultural environment to the influence of social community and media. Fortunately, the amygdala alone doesn't drive all of our behavior. Our brains have evolved so that we have a large and highly complex frontal cortex, which I mentioned earlier, the prefrontal cortex, which allows us to inhibit impulses, make complicated decisions, and behave in socially appropriate ways. It is the frontal cortex that helps most of us tamp down our gut reactions and in our conscious behaviors strive to treat members of all races equally. This slide reads, we don't consciously construct these definitions of normal or different, good or bad, acceptable or unacceptable. In fact, implicit and explicit biases often diverge. Our hidden biases may exist in spite of our genuine desire to be bias-free and in direct contradiction of the attitudes we believe we have. So as humans, we all hold biases. We are all subject to implicit bias because of our brain function, which I just demonstrated, and the influence of our cultural and social environments. Holding implicit biases doesn't make us bad. It means we are human. Studies show people can be consciously committed to egalitarianism and deliberately work to behave without prejudice, yet still possess hidden negative prejudices or stereotypes. So even though we believe we see and treat people as equals, hidden biases may still influence our perceptions and actions. The point here is that we are all affected by unconscious bias. It's deeply ingrained in our brains, but this doesn't mean we can't do anything about it. We really can by understanding the different types of bias and reflecting on our own personal habits. And our next speaker Shaila Rao Mistry, will talk a bit about some of that. This slide reads, we'd like to believe we are open-minded, fair, and without bias, but research shows otherwise. This is an important, even if uncomfortable, realization for most of us. And this is a quotation from a Dr. Mahzarin Banaji, who with two other colleagues developed a test called the implicit association test, which you can go online and take, and it does help you to understand what your unconscious biases might be on a number of things. So it's the IAT, developed at Harvard University by Dr. Banaji and two other colleagues. So take a few minutes to think about your own biases. Be completely honest. Are you, for instance, more likely to believe someone who has the same accent as you? Do you gravitate towards people with the same education or background as you? How important are first impressions to you? Are they lasting, and do they influence future decisions? If you have time and want to explore this further, write a list of all the situations when you've been biased and try and find the triggers. Because we know that prejudice against others based on race, religion, age, sex, body composition, etc., is dehumanizing, it is hard to allow ourselves to see our implicit biases. Understanding implicit bias helps us to slow down our decision-making by moving beyond the rapid and unconscious processes of the amygdala and move our decision-making to our prefrontal cortex, where our executive function and more objective evaluations can take place. Slower, more thoughtful decisions allow us to align our action with our true values. We all have biases. True leaders surface these and actively strive to overcome them and make sure they don't shape behavior or decisions. Companies need to encourage these courageous decisions. So says Carrie McPherson, who is a partner in Financial Service Officer Advisory in New York, EY New York. So your willingness to examine your own possible biases is an important step in understanding the roots of stereotypes and prejudice in our society. So what can I do about my unconscious biases? The first step, according to, again, to Dr. Banaji, is to, the first step to defeating our hidden biases is to be honest with ourselves about the blind spots we have. Having a bias is only human. The only shame is in making no effort to improve. And human beings are an improving species. We have been improving ourselves in every way over millennia. Another quotation from Dr. Banaji. So your takeaway from this webinar, I hope, is, as I've shown, the bad news is that the brain is structured to very quickly and unconsciously characterize someone we are meeting for the first time as friend or foe. That's being human. The good news is that we are more than our amygdala. Our brains are primarily made up of what's called the neocortex, part of the frontal cortex, which helps us reason and manage our responses. That means we can train ourselves to take a moment to process what's happening and determine what our course of action should be in a way that goes beyond our first impulse. This is true for each one of us, female, male, African American, Chinese, Caucasian, Indian, Native American, Latinx, whomever. Our brains have the plasticity to restructure and change a person's behavior. But this is not easy. It takes awareness, intention, and practice. Practice, practice, and more practice to change our neural pathways in our brains and our autopilot responses to people, things, and situations that we might see as a threat. So I would like to show a quick video now. And this video is available in the toolkit that Melissa was just talking about. It is in the other resources. So before I turn the mic over to Shaila Rao Mastri, would you please click on the video and let's take a look. It's called An Introduction to Unconscious Bias.
Your brain, by some accounts, receives roughly 11 million pieces of information each second, but your conscious brain is only able to process about 40. How do you handle all the rest? You handle it because you're really using two brains. Your conscious brain, which works with facts and data, has very little capacity and processes information slowly, and your unconscious brain, which is habit and intuition driven, has huge capacity and is really fast. One of your unconscious brain's best tricks is its ability to recognize patterns and use them to assign people and things to categories, allowing your unconscious brain to deal with all of the known, not dangerous issues, and leave only the few unknown or dangerous issues to your conscious brain. This allows us to recognize a pattern and act on it, rather than having to think about every interaction as if we were experiencing it for the first time. We can glance at that four-legged animal and know if it's a wolf or a cocker spaniel. That recognition allows us to make assumptions about the animal facing us, that the wolf belongs to the wild animal category and is likely to be dangerous, or that the cocker spaniel is in the domestic dog category and not likely to be dangerous. The assumptions we make about these pattern groups are likely to be based on our own experiences, on information we have gained from our culture or background, or from the media we listen to or people we admire. Unfortunately, those assumptions are often wrong. When we categorize people, our brains apply two other tools. One is affinity bias, a hardwired preference to respond positively to people who look, sound, and act like ourselves. Brain imaging scans show that when people are shown images of faces that differ from their own, it activates in milliseconds activity in the part of the unconscious brain that alerts us to possible danger. This may reflect a survival tool left over from ancient times when danger often came from those outside our immediate group. Today, however, This means the associations and biases are likely to be unconsciously activated every time when we come across a member of a group, even if we consciously reject group stereotypes. In addition to affinity bias, our unconscious brain categorizes people into groups and then connects those groups to our learned ideas or constructs about what is good or bad. Now, we've decided whether someone is like us or not, and whether they're good or not, all within milliseconds of meeting them. So, what can you do to manage your unconscious biases? You've already started by just learning about unconscious bias. Now, identify your own biases and address one at a time by building inclusive habits. Remember, if you do not intentionally, deliberately, and proactively include, you will unintentionally exclude.
So I will now turn the mic over to Shaila Rao Mistry.
Thank you, Constance. That was a very insightful presentation. I certainly learned a lot. My focus today is on manifestation of unconscious bias in education, work, life, and decision-making. Unconscious bias affects diversity and inclusion, and we're here to unpack that. So we're going to be highlighting some of the concepts and perspectives of bias experienced in childhood, education, and trace how it continues to interrupt adult work life, career advancement, access to resources, and alongside, we will highlight some ways to ameliorate and overcome bias. Bias is embedded in our subconscious, as we have heard, and comes in many forms. Unconscious or implicit bias are underlying attitudes and stereotypes that people attribute to a person or group, resulting in influencing their decision-making and their engagement with them. The affinity or similarity bias is the tendency, of course, as we heard, to connect with those with similar backgrounds and experiences. But the key is this: we seek a cultural fit, which means effectively we exclude those dissimilar, particularly affecting access to workplace advances, services, or membership. Other common biases are confirmation bias, which is where we draw conclusions based on personal beliefs, prejudices, rather than merit. Attribution bias is making those quick judgments based on predetermined perceptions. And conformity bias is succumbing to peer pressure and matching our opinions to match the majority. And gender bias is the one we're most familiar with, preferring one gender over another. Men select men as they are the majority gender in decision-making, and they get selected over women. Early barriers to girls and women in STEM contribute significantly to continued biases. Stereotypes about gender is ingrained in early childhood and continues from K to 12 and systematically steers girls out of STEM. Unknowingly, teachers, parents have a lower expectation of girls and send explicit and implicit messaging that boys are better at STEM. Of course, societal beliefs and learning environmental factors also diminish girls' interest in STEM. Now factor in diversity, economics, geographical advantages, and the gaps grow. With fewer STEM women role models, we see the perpetuation of exclusionary, male-dominated culture, which is of course unsupportive of women. And a hidden one is that of workplace harassment and gender devaluing biases, which also form barriers. Now, despite the upward trend of women entering STEM careers, they make up only 28% of the workforce in STEM. Men outnumber women in the fastest growing and the highest paid jobs of the future that are going to shape the future. All this despite starting out in equal numbers from high school and proven research evidence to dispel the myth that girls aren't interested in science or that they have less capability than boys. None of that is true. Technology, artificial intelligence, robotics, and communications control our existence, affecting all genders equally. Yet, men dominate in designing and programming of technology, including the crucial piece, the driver, embedded artificial intelligence. Technology was gender blind, yet today it is driven by men to the iniquitous exclusion of girls and women. Now, a futurist view of education sharply highlights the need to unlearn our gender biases and re-educate men and women, particularly as we are educating our K to 12 for future jobs, 85% of which are not yet invented. This emerging future requires individuals to have SEL, social emotional skills, taught only through technology, to produce technology-trained professionals who can adapt in any settings. And we particularly need women there to shape the future, our common future. Technology has changed what we learn, how we learn, and where we apply it. And certainly technology has driven all things work and play in the last 2 years and will continue to do so. So excluding girls and women from SEL learning gives bias a half-life, to use a scientific term, a half-life into the future. Closing the STEM gap through education matters. The future is now. Here we see the intersectionality of bias creep in at several overlapping identity roles. Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality conceptualizes how a person or group of people are affected by several discriminations and disadvantages. Now, these same overlapping experiences trigger causation and apply equally to how biases continue to exclude certain people and groups from access to jobs, education, leadership, resources, and economic security. So, have we moved the needle for women leaders? Taking a top-down view shows that we are still debating women's ability, willingness, and qualification to serve in high decision-making and on boards. Bias manifests at all levels, including high levels. Now, the business case for women's representation and leadership on boards is well established, with the evidence that the inclusion of women's perspectives and skill sets produces better financial and non-financial performance, including ESG. Nonetheless, progress in the US has been alarmingly slow, with only 19% of corporate board seats held by women. And the majority of Fortune Global 200 companies still have all-male boards. And of course, the Russell 3000 companies nationwide have only 5% women on their boards. In response, we do see leading financial US institutions taking some steps to drive change. NASDAQ SEC requires boards to have at least 2 diverse directors. And Goldman Sachs only takes a company public if they have at least 1 diverse board member. And the UN Global Compact, Target Gender Equality, imposes very ambitious targets of expectation for women on boards. And in California, we have passed legislation on women on boards, and other states have followed suit. Now, going back to the STEM education and the financial savvy and linkages, we see those appear here again. Amongst reasons cited for exclusion of women in high leadership roles is the perceived lack of technology or financial savvy. This is a perfect example of bias in the education leading to bias in later career advancement. Action to eliminating bias puts us on the road to greater participation of women in high decision making. Access. We need access to all the arenas listed here and the support of strong, unbiased leaders, men and women, all genders, particularly in unnoticed areas such as healthcare, financing, to start a business or access to procurement. So understanding hidden biases helps highlight the barriers to access and the associated privilege of advantage that distances others in the following areas: access to economic security for equity conversations on pay, position, and power; education, a lifeline for a better future; leadership, to create equitable policies and shape the future, expose biases; resources, for example, quality and quantity of access to healthcare; finances, to buy a home or to start a business; funding for students and professional advancement; and climate and peacekeeping. Diverse leadership is needed at the table. And a very emotive one is that of access to dignity and respect. We need best practices to interrupt and disrupt bias and ensure leadership is intentional, accountable, and committed to desired outcomes by creating a culture of inclusivity and diversity, building equity in STEM fields as a bridge to economic security, engaging men to help redress gender underrepresentation, using recruitment models to grow future unbiased leadership, using protocols of changing recruitment DNA to eliminate bias, using neutral language, objective criteria in job posting, interviewing diverse candidates, and establishing goals and measuring results. If you don't measure it, then you cannot shape direction. Rebranding perceptions away from stereotype characterizations, and we know so many, and building inclusive pipelines of potential candidates to fill that funnel. They're all there. We're all here. Bias starts with us and can only be ended by us with some necessary changes. There are many levels in which we can function, whether it's through as heads of organizations, as managers in our organizations, as workers in our organizations, and by ourselves. Learning to recognize unconscious bias within yourself is a critical first step in becoming a successful leader for the future. That future is here already. The future is now. How? By preventing biased thoughts from becoming actions. We may say we cannot help how we think, but we can certainly help how we act. Expanding our network to include people of diverse backgrounds and beliefs. And technology should certainly help that, because we can reach anybody. Seeking feedback from diverse perspectives, particularly opposing viewpoints. Each one of us know instances where we've learned more from someone who opposed us. Redefining our bias to seek similarities with those we have the most differences. Let's look for differences. Let's look for similarities rather than differences. And discuss unconscious bias openly, the elephant in the room, and lead teams and communities to do so also. In conclusion, engage in difficult conversations. You start first with yourself and then with others. How? Listen actively with respect for others. Speak from your own experiences instead of they or you. Challenge respectfully, but without personal attacks. Participate fully, be vocal, but make sure you give everybody else a voice, a chance to speak, include everyone. Avoid validating others' stories with your spin. It's their story. Let's hear their version. The goal is to gain deeper understanding, not to score a win. We only win if we all win together. Body language, nonverbal responses can be as respectful as words. So here we have provided additional resources, reading materials, printed materials. There are many books and articles that you can read to inform yourself further. And there's a number of websites here that will take you to take you to these sites that you can learn more about what we've been talking about and perhaps use at your chapter level or in your community or place of worship or at work. And here we've also put in links for activities that you can use, and also videos. We saw an excellent video. Sometimes a video is a good way to reach your audience in a humorous way. So as conclusion, the takeaway is together we advance. Together we can transform ideas to action for a better future. Thank you so much for your time. And now I pass it back to Melissa.
Thank you so much, Shyla and Constance, for again for the technical issues, but these slides will be posted on the link that Shannon put into the chat. So please feel free to reach out to us with any questions or comments you have about the slides once they're posted. And this webinar, the recording of the webinar, will be posted as well for your use. So now that we've given a baseline of
I'll pick up where Melissa left off, though, just so we don't have to keep everybody hanging here. So once you're in the toolkit main site, there is this resource section. It's just a little bit down off the page, and there's a section for plug and play DI programming. So you just simply click there. Melissa, you want to take it?
I think I'm here. Okay.
Okay.
So if computers don't work, phones do. So from here, what we try to do for all of our plug and play programs is organize it like a lesson plan to walk facilitators through how to conduct one of these discussions. And we want to gear these to people who don't have experience facilitating, but also make it useful to our really experienced moderators out in the field. So all of our plug and play programs have an overview about what we're doing, the purpose of this plug and play, and then we go into what we think that would help the facilitator prep for the program prior to the day. And one of these is what Constance talked about. It's the Harvard website for the implicit bias tests. So we recommend that the facilitator not only take a few of these tests him or herself, but to send that out to the members of your particular branch so that they have an idea of what implicit biases they may possess, to be able to reflect on that throughout the facilitation session. And as always, if there are any questions or concerns about any of the plug and plays or any of the recommendations that we have, feel free to contact us at diversity@aau.org. So once the plug and play is ready to be enacted, the facilitator has done the prep work, sent it out, the meeting is scheduled, we suggest that the facilitator during the actual session have expectations for not only him or herself, but for the participants as well. And then we recommend some basic introductory videos. One of the videos we do recommend is the one that Constance played, the Introduction to Unconscious Bias. So we have the link here, and it also is in the toolkit itself. Once you do the intro, we give some tips on facilitating the discussion. We give some basic questions to get you started, and then hopefully the discussion goes from there. That's really our big takeaways for today's inclusion and equity webinar. Our next webinar will be on the 2nd of December at 4 p.m. Eastern, and we will discuss creating inclusive spaces. So thank you so much for joining us today. We're so excited to have you and to share all of this with you and to learn from you throughout this. So with that, I will turn this over to Shannon. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Melissa and Constance and Shyla. I really appreciate your presentation today. And it's a really important topic. I think it's something that we hear a lot about, unconscious bias, but it can be sometimes difficult to sort of wrap your head around it and really do the hard work, I think, of noticing what your biases are and keep re-noticing them, because it's one of those things where you have to keep reminding yourself that they do exist. And as much as we all want to learn and to be unbiased, that doesn't actually happen, right? We all come to experiences with biases. And so it's just a really important topic, and something that I hope our members will really consider doing a program on in their local branches with the toolkit resources as well. So I'm looking through the Q&A. If folks have questions, please do pop them into the Q&A if you'd like. There's an interesting question from Jennifer here. What is an example of validating someone else's story with your own spin? Is that the same as paraphrasing? I think this is for you, Shyla, from your section of the presentation.
Thank you. Was that from Renee?
From Jennifer.
Thank you for the question, Jennifer. I read your question and I was thinking there are many examples. The most simple one I can give you is when someone is relating their story and additionally from another culture or even another circumstance, their experience of that story and what it means to them has very different significance to yours, which may also be similar. But what that means to them is very different. So at that point, it's more helpful to listen to their story all the way through and to approach it with, how can I help? How can I understand you better? And at another point, you can share your story. It doesn't invalidate the relevance of your story at all, but it makes sure that you're hearing what they have to say.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shyla. We also have a question from Renee here. I live in a somewhat monoculture. Any tips for increasing diversity within my organization? Let's start with Melissa, if I could, on that one.
So we struggle with this, honestly. We get this question a lot with our diversity officers, and how do we increase? Can you say that again? I want to make sure I get the verbiage right.
Yeah. Any tips for increasing diversity within my organization? Yes. That is fairly monoculture.
Okay. So I think that one of the best ways to increase diversity is to actively seek out people different than ourselves, which is difficult at times because we may not want to fully put ourselves out there and make ourselves vulnerable in that situation. But I think that's how we can show those similarities among us and people that may not on surface level look or feel or act similarly to us. So I think that first, putting yourself out there, being an authentic, vulnerable person is key. And then, as Shyla and Constance said, seeking the similarities and trying to find some common ground, even if it's just having conversations about our differences and opening that conversation. I think that those are two good ways to start. But we at National are looking to address that and give some very solid tips to the branches and the states on programs that they can enact.
Constance or Shyla, would you weigh in on that as well?
Constance has not spoken, so if you would like to answer first, I can go second.
That's okay, but thank you. I was thinking as I was listening to Melissa, I agree that need to have those dialogues to touch on those things that we have in common. But an important thing to consider is creating that safe space, that brave space to have those conversations, because it's not easy. As Shyla said in her presentation, these are difficult conversations. And if we're going to try to become more diverse and inclusive, yes, conversations are important, but we're going to have to do some work to be able to have those conversations.
Yes, so if I can add to that, Shannon?
Yes, please.
Yes. So what I was going to add to that is to make your organization diverse, and invite is first of all to go to the places where the diverse populations are, whether it's at work, whether it's at the library, whether it's in community organizations. Go to those organizations and invite people. It's that part we all have similarity. That if you invite people, they come. So go there and invite them. And also another way also is sometimes I know when you invite, it doesn't do the trick, but also to hold your meetings in those where those organizations might meet. So if you know that a certain community meets at the library for something, then make sure you also meet over there so they know what you're doing. And I always give this example. I'm a long time member of AAUW. And I was barely in my 20s and I saw AAUW gathering at the library. And I wheeled in my baby, my barely 8-month-old baby. I wheeled her in and I said, I want to join. And they all looked at me. Of course, they're all older than me. And they all looked at me. And of course, I'm a minority. And they were so pleased. So I saw that they were there and I went up to them. So I'm saying we can do the reverse as well. When we see where young people gather, where young people meet, and this can happen with online as well. There's so many organizations that you could approach and be part of and say, please come. Thank you.
Thank you, Shyla and Constance and Melissa. This has been a really great session. Really appreciate your work on this and your being with us today here. And I want to thank everybody who attended today. There's some really great resources in the toolkit, and we hope that this will be another program, another tool in your toolbox that you can use at the branch level to have some programming. So thanks to everybody for participating. Please do fill out the post-webinar survey that will be coming your way. It really does help us to help refine our presentations moving forward. And we look forward to seeing you all December 2nd, as Melissa noted, for our next Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion webinar on creating inclusive spaces. So I think that's going to be a really great session as well. And we look forward to seeing you all then. So thank you so much, everyone. And I hope you have a really wonderful evening.